Robin Williams, the comedic genius who made the entire world laugh, spent his final hours in the quiet of his Tiburon, California home on the morning of August 11th, 2014. But inside that silence was a brutal, invisible war. When the news of his death by suicide broke, it sent a seismic shockwave of collective grief and disbelief across the globe. An entire generation felt as though a fundamental source of joy in the world had been extinguished. The immediate screaming question that echoed from every news report and every tearful conversation was, why? How could the man who embodied manic, life-affirming laughter, a whirlwind of boundless energy and kindness, succumb to such a profound and final despair? The world scrambled for an explanation, settling on the familiar tragic narrative of the sad clown. A man who could make everyone happy but himself. A story compounded by his public admissions of battling depression and addiction. But this was only a fraction of the truth. With hundreds of roles and thousands of laughs, he was a symbol of joy. But in the end, Robin became a prisoner of his own mind. The real story, a tragedy of almost Shakespearean proportions, was far more complex and terrifying. For in his final months, Robin Williams was not just fighting his old demons, he was being stalked by a hidden, merciless, and undiagnosed neurological disease that was systematically dismantling his brilliant mind, his reality, and his very soul. To understand the man who left the world in such sorrow, one must journey back to a quiet, lonely childhood in a series of large, empty houses, where a small boy with a vast imagination first learned to populate the silence with 1,000 different voices. Robin McLaurin Williams was born on July 21, 1951, in Chicago, Illinois, into a world of immense privilege and profound solitude. His life was not a Dickensian struggle against poverty. It was a quieter, more insidious struggle against isolation. His father, Robert Fitzgerald Williams, was a formidable figure, a senior executive for Ford's prestigious Lincoln Mercury division. He was a man forged in the crucible of the Great Depression and World War II, a dignified, reserved, and often emotionally distant patriarch who was the epitome of the mid-century corporate man. His work demanded frequent relocations, moving the family from the shores of Lake Michigan to the sprawling, manicured suburbs of Detroit, and finally to the hills of Marin County, California. His mother, Lori McLaurin, was a former model from New Orleans, a witty, elegant, and often flamboyant woman who was a fixture on the local charity circuit. She was a gracious hostess and a sparkling personality, but for a young Robin, she was often a distant, beloved star in his own home. He was, for all intents and purposes, an only child. He had 2 older half-brothers from his parents' previous marriages, Robert and McLaurin, but they were significantly older and did not live with him during his formative years. Consequently, his childhood was largely a solitary one, spent in a succession of vast, intimidating houses. The most emblematic of these was a 40-room mansion on a 20-acre estate in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. It was a home built for a corporate titan's family, yet for a small, lonely boy, its long, echoing hallways and countless empty rooms were not a playground, but a kingdom of isolation. It was in this kingdom that his genius was born. To combat the silence and the profound loneliness, he retreated to the attic, his private sanctuary. There, with his vast collection of thousands of toy soldiers, he created his own world. He staged epic, complex battles, but more importantly, he gave every single soldier a unique voice, a distinct personality, and a detailed backstory. He would create entire dialogues, shifting accents and attitudes with a dizzying speed. He mimicked the politicians he saw on the news, the characters he heard on the radio. This was not just a child's game. It was a psychological coping mechanism of staggering complexity. It was the primordial ooze of his improvisational genius, a self-taught masterclass in character creation. He was learning how to become a multitude of people as a way of escaping the loneliness of being just one small boy. His humor, which would later become his shield and his sword in the outside world, was first forged as a tool to connect with his elegant but often reserved mother. He discovered, with the keen insight of a child desperate for connection, that making her laugh was a way to break through her formal exterior, a way to earn her focused attention and affection. Laughter, he learned, was a currency of love. The family's final move to Marin County, California during his high school years was a liberation. He was no longer the overweight, lonely child of the Midwest. He shed his weight, grew his hair long, and most importantly, discovered the drama club at Redwood High School. For the first time, the 1,000 voices he had cultivated in private had a public stage. He was a supernova of talent, and in the liberal, countercultural atmosphere of late 1960s California, his anarchic energy was not just accepted, but celebrated. He found his tribe. He was voted most humorous by his graduating class, but also, in a perfect paradoxical summary of a young man whose genius was still too raw for the conventional world to understand, least likely to succeed. After a brief, unfulfilling stint studying political science at Claremont Men's College, he took a step that would define his artistic path. He applied and was accepted on a full scholarship to the legendary Juilliard School in New York City to study acting. In 1973, he was one of only 20 students accepted into the freshman class, and one of only 2 along with his new roommate, a tall, athletic, and classically trained young actor named Christopher Reeve, who were immediately accepted into the prestigious advanced program, taught by the formidable actor and producer John Houseman. The contrast between the 2 roommates was stark. Reeve was the disciplined Apollonian classical thespian, a master of text and technique. Williams was the raw, untamable Dionysian force of nature. They formed an immediate, deep, and lifelong friendship, a bond of opposites who recognized the profound talent in each other. Reeve, who often had to float the perpetually broke Williams money from his own stipend, would later describe watching Robin's mind work as being like watching a channel surfer on speed, a dazzling, overwhelming, and utterly unique display of mental agility. At Juilliard, Williams was both a prodigy and a problem. His talent was so immense and so singular that it could not be contained by the school's rigid classical curriculum, which was heavily focused on Shakespeare and the great European playwrights. He could master any accent, any dialect in an instant. He could improvise entire, brilliant scenes from a single word, leaving his teachers and fellow students in a state of stunned, helpless laughter. He famously excelled at mime, a silent medium that somehow seemed to unleash his physical comedy in its purest form. But he struggled with the structured demands of classical theater. Why stick to the script when his own mind could generate 1,000 funnier, stranger, more interesting possibilities in a single moment? It was the legendary John Houseman who recognized that trying to fit this square peg into a round hole was not just futile, but a disservice to his unique genius. In his second year, Houseman called Williams into his office and famously told him that he was wasting his time at Juilliard, that there was nothing more they could teach him. He advised him to leave and start performing, to unleash his unique gift upon the world. It was both the ultimate compliment and a recognition that Robin Williams was an artist who could not be taught. He simply had to be. Taking the advice, Williams left Juilliard before graduating, heading west to San Francisco, a city whose bohemian countercultural spirit was the perfect laboratory for the next explosive phase of his career. San Francisco in the mid-1970s was a city still vibrating with the aftershocks of the counterculture revolution. The bohemian anti-establishment spirit that had defined the Haight-Ashbury scene had migrated into the city's burgeoning comedy clubs. These were not the polite, joke-telling venues of the past. They were gritty, experimental laboratories for a new, post-Vietnam, post-Watergate generation of comedians. The comedy was sharp, political, personal, and often fueled by a then ubiquitous and seemingly glamorous substance, cocaine. It was into this creatively fertile, high-energy, and deeply dangerous ecosystem that Robin Williams, the Juilliard-trained actor, crash-landed, ready to unleash the 1,000 voices he had cultivated in his lonely childhood attic. He began his career not in prestigious theaters, but on the tiny, beer-soaked stages of clubs like the Holy City Zoo and the Other Cafe, working as a bartender to pay the bills. At night, he would take the stage, and what poured out of him was unlike anything the scene had ever witnessed. It was not traditional stand-up comedy with its structured setup punchline rhythm. It was a form of high-velocity, free associative, improvisational performance art. He was a human superconductor, channeling the zeitgeist of the room, the headlines of the day, the strange characters in the front row, and the deepest, most bizarre corners of his own psyche into a relentless stream of consciousness monologue. He would ricochet from a Shakespearean soliloquy to a redneck caricature to a manic, sputtering alien, often in the space of a single breathless sentence. His mind was a supercomputer running 1,000 programs at once, and his mouth was the speaker, struggling to keep up with the processing speed. The classical training from Juilliard was still there, a bedrock of technique, but it was buried under an avalanche of raw, untamed, and utterly brilliant chaos. This explosive, almost terrifying genius was both a gift and a curse. It was fueled by a profound, deep-seated insecurity, the same loneliness that had defined his childhood. The stage was the one place he felt truly seen, where the chaos in his head was not a source of anxiety, but a source of applause and adoration. The laughter was a drug, a temporary cure for the quiet hum of his own sadness. And it was during this period that he discovered a chemical co-pilot for his manic genius: alcohol and cocaine. The drugs did not create his talent, but they acted as an accelerant, a way to lower his already thin inhibitions and allow the raw, unfiltered energy to flow without the interference of his own self-doubt. The comedy club culture of the 70s was a world of excess, and Robin dove in headfirst. The line between the onstage persona, the manic, fast-talking, anything for a laugh madman, and the offstage man began to blur dangerously. His reputation as the most original, most explosive comedian on the West Coast grew rapidly. He moved to Los Angeles, where he became a regular at the Comedy Store, the legendary club on the Sunset Strip that was the epicenter of the stand-up boom. It was here in 1977 that he was spotted by television producer Gary Marshall. Marshall, the creator of some of television's most wholesome and successful sitcoms, was in the process of casting a bizarre one-off episode of his #1 rated show, Happy Days. The episode, titled My Favorite Orkan, required an actor to play an alien named Mork who comes to Earth to abduct Richie Cunningham. The part was a throwaway, a gimmick, but when Robin Williams walked into the audition, the course of television history changed. The story of the audition is now a legendary piece of Hollywood lore. Marshall, a veteran producer who had seen it all, asked the unknown young comedian to take a seat. Instead of sitting on the chair, Williams immediately flipped himself upside down, resting his head on the seat cushion in a perfect headstand, and began to speak. In that single brilliant and completely unexpected act of physical and mental absurdity, Marshall saw the character. Mork was not just an alien. Mork was Robin Williams. He was cast on the spot. The episode aired in February 1978, and the public reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. In a show known for its comfortable, nostalgic charm, Williams's performance was an anarchic, hilarious alien invasion. He ad-libbed. He created his own strange alien language, Nanu Nanu, Shazbot. He riffed on pop culture, and he ran comedic rings around the show's established stars, Henry Winkler and Ron Howard. The network was flooded with letters and phone calls, all demanding to see more of the strange, lovable alien from Mork. The response was so massive that Gary Marshall and ABC did something almost unprecedented. They immediately created a spin-off series for a character who had appeared in a single episode of another show. Mork Mindy, which premiered in the fall of 1978, was a rocket ship. The show was an immediate colossal hit, becoming one of the highest-rated shows on television and a pop culture phenomenon. It transformed Robin Williams, almost overnight, from a respected but niche stand-up comedian into a global superstar. At 27 years old, he was the face of a hit network sitcom, his face plastered on the cover of Time magazine in March 1979, which called him a new, uncapped geyser of comedy. He was now a household name, a beloved icon to children and adults alike. The moment he flipped upside down on the chair at the audition didn't just win him the role, it launched the legendary trajectory and the immense pressure that would weigh on him for the rest of his life. The success of Mork and Mindy was entirely dependent on the singular, untamable genius of its star. The scripts were often written with large, empty blocks, simply stating, "Mork does his thing." The thing was Robin unleashed, improvising entire, brilliant comedic runs that would leave the studio audience in hysterics and his co-star, Pam Dauber, struggling to keep a straight face. He was a force of nature, but the pressure of being the sole engine of a massive television hit was immense. The network wanted Mork, the lovable, childlike alien, and Robin felt the immense pressure to deliver week after week. Simultaneously, his stand-up career exploded. He was now a stadium-filling act. His first HBO special, Robin Williams' Live at the Roxy, 1978, captured the raw, uncut, and far more adult-oriented nature of his comedic genius for a national audience. The performance was a revelation, a 90-minute cocaine-fueled stream of consciousness masterpiece that cemented his status as the most electrifying and dangerous comedian of his generation. The success was stratospheric, but it came at a terrifying cost. The shy, lonely boy from the empty mansion was now the most famous comedian in the world, and he was living the rock and roll lifestyle that came with it. The drugs and alcohol were no longer just a part of the scene. They were a daily necessity, the fuel required to maintain the impossible velocity of his life. He had reached the summit, but he was standing on the edge of a volcano, a fact that would be made terrifyingly clear in the coming years. The supernova of fame ignited by Mork and Mindy and his explosive HBO specials presented Robin Williams with his next great challenge: conquering the world of cinema. The transition from television stardom to legitimate movie stardom is one of the most treacherous journeys in Hollywood, a path littered with the failed careers of beloved TV actors who couldn't make the leap. For Williams, the challenge was even more pronounced. His comedic genius was so singular, so improvisational, and so tied to a live audience that containing it within the structured, repetitive, and often sterile confines of a film set seemed almost impossible. His first major foray into film was the ambitious, large-scale 1980 musical production of Popeye, directed by the legendary and iconoclastic filmmaker Robert Altman. The role seemed, on paper, to be a perfect fit, a live-action cartoon character who required a high level of physical comedy and a unique, mumbled vocal delivery. The production, filmed on the island of Malta, was notoriously chaotic, a logistical and creative nightmare that battled difficult weather and a ballooning budget. Williams, ever the professional, fully committed to the role, perfectly capturing the character's strange physicality and speech patterns. However, when the film was released, it was met with a deeply divided critical reception and was a commercial disappointment in the United States. It was his first major professional stumble, a public lesson in the brutal realities of the movie business. The man who could do no wrong on television was suddenly vulnerable. While his film career struggled to find its footing, his personal life was moving at a breakneck pace, fueled by the excesses of his immense fame and the hard partying culture of the early 1980s. His addiction to cocaine and alcohol, which had begun in the comedy clubs, now escalated in the high-stakes world of Hollywood. Cocaine was the fuel that allowed him to maintain his manic on-stage persona and his punishing work schedule. It was a ubiquitous part of a social scene that included other brilliant, hard-living talents of his generation, most notably the cast of Saturday Night Live. He formed a close, chaotic friendship with John Belushi, another volcanic, once-in-a-generation comedic talent who was also engaged in a dangerous dance with addiction. They were kindred spirits, two men who burned with an almost impossibly bright and self-destructive energy. That dangerous dance came to a sudden, tragic, and horrifying end on the morning of March 5, 1982. John Belushi was found dead of a cocaine and heroin overdose in a bungalow at the Chateau Marmont. The news was a devastating personal blow to Williams, but it was also a terrifying, life-altering wake-up call. Williams had been with Belushi at the Chateau Marmont in the final hours of his life, sharing in the drug-fueled chaos of his final binge. The death of his friend was not an abstract tragedy. It was a visceral, terrifying look in the mirror. It was a glimpse of his own potential future. In that moment, the party was over. The shock of Belushi's death, combined with another life-altering event, the birth of his first son, Zachary "Zach" Williams, in 1983 from his first marriage to Valerie Velarde, became the catalyst for a profound change. Staring at his newborn son and haunted by the ghost of his fallen friend, Williams made the decision to quit cocaine and heavy drinking, cold turkey. It was his first major conscious battle for sobriety, a retreat from the edge of the abyss he had seen claim his friend. Sober and with a new sense of purpose as a father, he rededicated himself to his film career, determined to find a cinematic identity that could contain his unique talent. He made a series of interesting, often brilliant but commercially unsuccessful films. He gave a beautifully nuanced and soulful performance as the title character in the 1982 adaptation of the complex John Irving novel, The World According to Garp. He starred in the dark comedy The Survivors 1983 with Walter Matthau, and gave a heartfelt performance as a Russian defector in Paul Mazursky's Moscow on the Hudson, 1984. These films proved his dramatic abilities, but they struggled to find a wide audience. Hollywood still didn't know what to do with him. He was too big, too unique, too hard to define. The breakthrough, the film that finally and perfectly bridged the gap between his manic improvisational genius and the demands of a cinematic narrative, came in 1987. The film was Good Morning Vietnam, and the role was that of Adrian Cronauer, a real-life, rebellious armed forces radio DJ who had shaken up the airwaves in 1965 Saigon. The script had been in development for years, but no one could figure out how to crack it. It was director Barry Levinson who had the key. He recognized that the only way to capture the spirit of Cronauer and the genius of Robin Williams was to abandon the script for the on-air radio segments and simply let Robin be Robin. For 2 weeks, they put Williams in a radio studio with a microphone and a stack of 1960s records and let him improvise. The result was pure, uncut comedic brilliance. He riffed on the war, the politicians, the heat, creating a torrent of characters, sound effects, and inspired madness. This raw, improvised comedy was then woven into the film's more structured, dramatic narrative about a man trying to bring a little bit of truth and laughter into the absurdity of war. The combination was electrifying. His performance was a tour de force, capturing not just Cronauer's hilarious anti-authoritarian spirit, but also the deep well of sadness and humanity beneath the manic exterior. It was the first time a film had successfully showcased the full spectrum of his talent, the explosive comedy and the profound soulful depth. The film was a massive critical and commercial success. It was a box office smash, and it earned Robin Williams his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. The nomination was a monumental achievement. It was a validation from the industry, a recognition that he was not just a television star or a stand-up comedian, but one of the most talented and versatile actors of his generation. The man who had been least likely to succeed had finally and definitively conquered the big screen. The Academy Award nomination for Good Morning Vietnam was a watershed moment. It fundamentally altered the perception of Robin Williams in the eyes of the industry and the world. He was no longer just a television star who could sell movie tickets. He was a serious, dramatic actor of the highest caliber. This newfound respect, combined with his proven box office power, ushered in the most creatively fertile and critically acclaimed period of his entire career. From the late 1980s through the 1990s, Williams embarked on an extraordinary run of films, showcasing a breathtaking versatility that few actors in history have ever matched. He was a creative juggernaut, moving seamlessly between profound drama, family-friendly comedy, and groundbreaking voice work, often in the same year. The first major artistic statement of this new era was Peter Weir's 1989 masterpiece, Dead Poets Society. The role of John Keating, an unorthodox and inspirational English teacher at a stuffy, conservative New England prep school, was a significant departure for Williams. Unlike the manic energy of Adrian Cronauer, Keating was a character of quiet conviction and intellectual passion. Williams dialed back his improvisational instincts, delivering a performance of immense warmth, restraint, and understated power. He was not the explosive center of the film, he was its soulful, inspirational guide. The film's famous "Oh Captain, My Captain" scene, where his students stand on their desks in a final act of defiant loyalty, became an enduring cultural touchstone, a cinematic symbol of nonconformity and the power of art. The film was a global success, and it earned Williams his second consecutive Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. He had proven definitively that Good Morning Vietnam was not a fluke. He immediately followed this with a series of roles that further demonstrated his astonishing range. In Penny Marshall's 1990 drama Awakenings, he co-starred with Robert De Niro, delivering a performance of profound subtlety and compassion as Dr. Malcolm Sayer, a shy, dedicated, and deeply introverted research physician. It was a complete erasure of his usual persona, a testament to his classical training and his ability to disappear inside a character. Then in 1991, he starred in Terry Gilliam's urban fantasy, The Fisher King. The role of Perry, a traumatized, homeless former professor who has retreated into a medieval fantasy world, was a perfect synthesis of his unique talents. It required him to be both hilariously manic, as he leads his friend on a quest for the Holy Grail in Central Park, and devastatingly heartbreaking as the audience slowly learns the horrific tragedy that shattered his mind. It was a performance of raw, exposed nerve vulnerability that earned him his third Oscar nomination in 5 years. He was now, unarguably, one of the most respected dramatic actors in the world. It was in this climate of immense critical respect that he took on a role that would, paradoxically, become one of his most influential and revolutionary. A role where his face was never even seen. In 1992, he signed on to voice the genie in the Disney animated film Aladdin. Before Williams, voice acting in major animated films was primarily the domain of talented but largely anonymous voice actors. Williams, armed with his superhuman improvisational abilities, completely changed the game. The script for the genie was written with him in mind, but the directors, Ron Clements and John Musker, made the brilliant decision to simply let him improvise. For over 20 hours of recording sessions, Williams unleashed a torrent of characters, impressions, and comedic ideas, riffing on everything from Jack Nicholson and William F. Buckley to pop culture references that were years ahead of their time. He was a one-man creative whirlwind, and the animators were left with the Herculean task of creating a character that could visually keep up with his vocal pyrotechnics. His performance as the genie was not just a great voice acting job, it was a watershed moment in the history of animation. It proved that the comedic genius of a single A-list superstar could be the primary engine and marketing tool for a major animated feature. The film was a global phenomenon, the highest-grossing film of 1992, and it paved the way for the entire star-driven model of animated films that would dominate the next 2 decades. Williams's work was so singular that the Golden Globes created a special award to honor his performance. However, this triumph was also marked by a conflict that demonstrated his artistic integrity. He had agreed to a smaller salary on the condition that his voice and the genie character would not be heavily used in the film's marketing. When Disney reneged on this agreement, he publicly broke with the studio, refusing to work on the sequel, a principled stand that was almost unheard of for a star of his magnitude. He followed the global success of Aladdin with another box office behemoth, the 1993 family comedy Mrs. Doubtfire. The film was the ultimate showcase for his unique talents, requiring incredible physical comedy, brilliant voice work, and, at its core, a deeply moving performance as a father so desperate to be with his children that he is willing to transform himself into an elderly Scottish nanny. The film was a global sensation, cementing his status as one of the most beloved and bankable stars in the world. Throughout this period of unprecedented success, his personal life was in a state of flux. His first marriage to Valerie Velarde ended in divorce, and in 1989 he married his son's nanny, Marcia Garces, with whom he would have 2 children, Zelda and Cody. This second marriage, which would last for 19 years, became a grounding force in his life, with Marcia often acting as a key producing partner on his films. But even amidst this relative domestic stability and a period of sobriety, the immense pressure of maintaining his level of success was a constant underlying strain. The culmination of his long journey for critical acceptance came in 1997 with the film Good Will Hunting. The script, famously written by 2 unknown young actors named Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, contained a supporting role that seemed tailor-made for Williams's unique blend of humor and pathos. Sean Maguire, a community college psychology professor who is as wounded and brilliant as his genius-level patient. It was another role that required immense restraint. His performance was a masterclass in compassionate, understated wisdom. The famous monologue he delivers about his late wife, a scene which he largely improvised, was a moment of pure, heartbreaking authenticity. And the film's climactic repeated line, "It's not your fault," became a therapeutic mantra for an entire generation. The line, "It's not your fault," wasn't just for Will Hunting. It was as if Robin was saying it to himself and to anyone in the audience trapped in their own silent pain. On the night of the 70th Academy Awards in 1998, after 3 previous nominations for Best Actor, Robin Williams won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. The standing ovation was thunderous, a release of years of affection and respect from the entire industry. His speech was a perfect encapsulation of who he was, funny, humble, and deeply emotional. The win was the ultimate validation, not for his explosive comedy, but for his profound ability to convey human pain, empathy, and healing. He was now, officially and forever, an Academy Award winner, the undisputed king of both comedy and drama, standing at the absolute peak of his profession. The Academy Award win for Good Will Hunting was the culmination of a decade-long artistic journey. A definitive statement that Robin Williams was not just a comedian who could act, but one of the most profound and versatile actors of his generation. Having reached the summit, he entered the 2000s with a new kind of artistic freedom. He no longer had anything to prove. This freedom led him to explore the darkest and most challenging roles of his career. a deliberate and fascinating pivot away from the lovable, inspirational figures he had perfected. He seemed determined to explore the full, often unsettling spectrum of human nature, to prove that the same man who could embody pure joy could also embody pure evil. In 2002, he delivered a trio of performances that stunned audiences and critics alike. In the dark psychological thriller 1 Hour Photo, he underwent a startling physical and emotional transformation to play Seymour Cy Parrish, a lonely, obsessive, and deeply disturbed photo technician who becomes dangerously fixated on a suburban family. Williams bleached his hair blonde, adopted a quiet, meticulous, and chillingly blank demeanor, and completely erased his own charismatic personality. His performance was a terrifying portrait of loneliness and obsession, a deep dive into the mind of a man whose humanity had curdled into something monstrous. That same year, he played the manipulative, sociopathic killer Walter Finch in Christopher Nolan's acclaimed thriller Insomnia, going toe-to-toe with Al Pacino. And in the dark comedy Death to Smoochie, he played a disgraced, vengeful children's television host. This trifecta of darkness was a bold, audacious move for a beloved star, a declaration that he was an artist who refused to be confined by the public's expectations. While he was exploring these professional shadows, his personal demons, which had been dormant for years, began to re-emerge. In 2003, while working on a film in a remote part of Alaska, the profound loneliness and the immense, ever-present pressure of his life led him to a relapse. He started drinking again. As he would later explain, he believed he could control it, that he could have just one drink. But for an addict, one is too many, and 1,000 is never enough. His relapse into alcoholism, which he publicly and bravely admitted to in 2006 before checking himself into rehab, was a devastating setback. The long, quiet war he had been fighting within himself had flared up once more. This personal struggle, combined with the immense strain of his career, led to the end of his second marriage to Marcia Garces in 2010. In 2009, he also faced a major health crisis, undergoing emergency open-heart surgery to replace an aortic valve. He was mortal, after all. The final years of his life were marked by a quiet and then terrifying decline. A tragedy that was happening in plain sight but was fundamentally misunderstood by everyone around him, including himself. He continued to work, starring in the 2013 television series The Crazy Ones, but the spark, the legendary lightning-fast improvisational genius, was beginning to flicker. On set, a place where he had always been a master, he was now struggling. He had difficulty remembering his lines, a problem he had never experienced in his entire career. This struggle, for a man whose mind was his greatest instrument, was a source of deep, terrifying insecurity and anxiety. Privately, a far more horrifying war was being waged. As his wife, Susan Schneider Williams, would later reveal in a heartbreaking essay titled, "The Terrorist Inside My Husband's Brain," he was being besieged by a bewildering and terrifying array of symptoms. He was suffering from intense, debilitating anxiety, crippling paranoia, and delusions that would send him into a state of confusion. His mind, once a supercomputer of wit and intelligence, was betraying him. He was losing control. With hundreds of roles and thousands of laughs, he was a symbol of joy. But in the end, Robin became a prisoner of his own mind. Doctors were baffled. He was initially and incorrectly diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a diagnosis that he struggled to accept but that did not fully explain the severe psychiatric symptoms he was enduring. The hidden, merciless antagonist in this final act was a devastating, degenerative brain disease called Lewy Body Dementia, LBD. The disease, which can only be definitively diagnosed after death, attacks the brain, causing a terrifying decline in cognitive abilities, memory and motor function while also producing severe psychiatric symptoms like hallucinations and paranoia. In his final months, Robin Williams was a man living in a waking nightmare, bravely fighting a battle against an enemy he couldn't see and a disease he didn't know he had. His mind, the source of his genius, had become his prison. This brings us back to that quiet, tragic morning on August 11th, 20. His death by suicide was not, as the world initially believed, a simple surrender to depression. It was the final desperate act of a man trying to escape an inescapable neurological torture. The subsequent autopsy and the posthumous diagnosis of severe, diffuse Lewy Body Dementia completely reframed the tragedy. He had not lost his mind. His mind was being systematically destroyed by a brutal, incurable disease. The legacy of Robin Williams is as vast, as complex, and as beautiful as the man himself. He was a comedic supernova, a once-in-a-generation talent whose improvisational genius remains unparalleled. He was a brilliant, Oscar-winning dramatic actor who could break our hearts with a single soulful glance. He was a tireless humanitarian who used his fame to support causes like comic relief, and who performed for thousands of troops on USO tours, seeing it as his duty to bring laughter to those in the darkest of places. His kindness and generosity were legendary, attested to by countless friends and colleagues. The final tragic chapter of his life has become a legacy in itself, bringing global awareness to the devastating effects of Lewy body dementia and the critical link between neurological disease and mental health. He once filled the empty rooms of his childhood with 1,000 voices. And to this day, the laughter of Robin Williams still echoes, a reminder that kindness and talent can be immortal even when the person is gone.